The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez adjusted the straps of her tactical vest one final time. She had been assigned to what everyone called grunt work, moving sandbags to reinforce the perimeter defenses. It wasn't glamorous, but it needed to be done, and she had learned long ago not to complain about assignments. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow as she lifted another heavy sandbag from the truck. The fabric was rough against her gloves, and the weight made her shoulders ache, but she kept a steady rhythm. Around her, other soldiers were doing the same work, their faces showing the strain of the repetitive task. The base was preparing for increased security measures, though nobody had told them exactly why. "Keep it moving, people!" shouted Sergeant Williams, the supervisor for this detail. He walked up and down the line of workers, checking their progress. "Command wants these barriers up by 1400 hours, and we're already behind schedule." Sarah nodded and continued her work. She had been at this base for 3 months now, ever since her last assignment had ended. Most people assumed she was just another regular soldier, maybe infantry or logistics. She never corrected them. It was easier that way, and it kept questions to a minimum. As she bent down to grab another sandbag, she noticed a small group of officers walking toward their work area. They were deep in conversation, pointing at various sections of the perimeter and discussing something that looked important. Sarah recognized the base commander, Colonel Peterson, among them, but there were others she didn't know, higher-ranking officers with more decorations on their uniforms. "Wonder what all the brass is doing here," muttered Private Johnson, who was working next to her. "Don't usually see that many eagles and stars wandering around the construction sites." Sarah glanced over briefly, but continued working. She had learned to keep her head down and focus on the task at hand. Military bases were full of inspections and visits from higher command. It was probably just routine. The officers moved closer, and Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation. They were discussing readiness levels and deployment schedules, something about increased threat assessments and the need for specialized personnel. She tried not to listen too closely. Operational security was always important, even for seemingly innocent conversations. "The enemy has been using more sophisticated tactics lately," she heard Colonel Peterson saying to a general she didn't recognize. "We need people who can adapt quickly and think outside the box." The general nodded gravely. "That's exactly why we're here, Colonel. We're looking for the right kind of personnel for a special operation that's being planned. People with specific skill sets and experience." Sarah positioned another sandbag and tried to ignore the conversation. She had heard similar discussions before, and they usually didn't involve people like her, at least not in her current assignment. She was just another soldier doing manual labor as far as anyone here knew. The heat was getting stronger as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Sarah's uniform was starting to stick to her skin with perspiration, but she kept working steadily. The sandbags seemed to get heavier with each one she moved, but she maintained her pace. Physical endurance had always been one of her strengths. "You know, Martinez," said Private Johnson, "you handle those bags like they're nothing. Most of us are struggling after the first hour, but you haven't even slowed down." Sarah shrugged. "Just used to physical work, I guess." It was a simple answer, but it wasn't entirely true. Her stamina and strength came from years of specialized training that most soldiers never received. Training that had taught her to push through exhaustion, to maintain focus under pressure, and to keep going when others would give up. But that was information she kept to herself. The group of officers had stopped about 20 feet away from where she was working. They seemed to be having an intense discussion about something, their voices low but urgent. Sarah caught the general looking in her direction a couple of times, though she couldn't be sure if he was actually watching her or just surveying the work area in general. "We need to identify personnel who have demonstrated exceptional capabilities," the general was saying. "People who might be flying under the radar in regular assignments." Colonel Peterson nodded. "We've been reviewing files, but sometimes the best candidates aren't necessarily the ones with the most obvious qualifications on paper." Sarah felt a slight unease building in her stomach. Conversations like this often led to unexpected reassignments, and she had been hoping to stay in her current low-profile position for a while longer. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself or her background. She focused on her breathing and kept working. The sandbags needed to be positioned precisely to create an effective barrier, and she took pride in doing the job correctly. Each bag had to be placed just right, overlapping with the ones beside it to create a stable wall that could withstand impact. The morning wore on, and the pile of sandbags gradually diminished as the barriers grew higher. Sarah's team was making good progress, and it looked like they would meet the deadline that Sergeant Williams had emphasized. The work was mindless in some ways, but it also required attention to detail and coordination with the other workers. As she reached for another sandbag, Sarah noticed that the general had separated from the group and was walking directly toward her work area. His stride was purposeful, and his eyes seemed to be fixed on something specific. She tried to act natural and continued with her task, but her awareness heightened instinctively. The general stopped just a few feet away from where she was working. Sarah could feel his presence, but she didn't look up immediately. In the military, we didn't make eye contact with high-ranking officers unless they specifically addressed you or you had been given permission. Soldier, the general's voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. Sarah straightened up and turned to face him, snapping to attention. Yes, sir. The general's eyes moved over her uniform, taking in details that most people wouldn't notice. His gaze lingered for just a moment on her tactical vest, specifically on the area where unit patches were typically displayed. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. What's your name and assignment here? The general asked. Private First Class Sarah Martinez, sir. Currently assigned to base maintenance and security detail. The general nodded slowly, as if processing this information. Behind him, Colonel Peterson and the other officers had stopped their conversation and were watching the interaction with interest. The general took a step closer, and Sarah noticed his eyes narrow slightly as he focused on something specific on her vest. There, partially hidden beneath a fold in the fabric, was the edge of a small patch. It was mostly concealed, and most people would never notice it or think anything of it if they did. But this general was clearly not most people. The general's expression changed subtly as his eyes focused on the partially visible patch on Sarah's vest. What had started as a routine inspection of base operations suddenly became something much more significant. The small piece of fabric that peeked out from beneath the fold of her tactical gear was distinctive in a way that very few people would recognize. Interesting, the general murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a lower tone. That's quite an unusual patch you have there, soldier. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she maintained her military bearing. She had hoped that the patch would remain completely hidden, but the physical demands of moving sandbags had apparently shifted her vest enough to expose a corner of it. The patch itself was small and understated, nothing like the bright, colorful unit insignia that most soldiers wore proudly on their uniforms. Sir, I'm not sure what you're referring to, Sarah replied carefully, though she knew exactly what he had seen. The general studied her face for a moment, looking for any sign of deception or recognition. Don't play games with me, Martinez. I know what that patch represents, and I know what it means that you're wearing it. Around them, the other soldiers continued moving sandbags, but Sarah could sense that some of them were stealing glances in her direction. The presence of a general questioning one of the workers was unusual enough to draw attention, even though most of them were trying to mind their own business. Colonel Peterson approached the general, his expression showing curiosity and concern. General Harrison, is there something I should know about one of my personnel? General Harrison didn't take his eyes off Sarah. Colonel, what can you tell me about Private Martinez's background and qualifications? Colonel Peterson looked surprised by the question. He glanced at Sarah, then back at the general. She's been assigned here for about 3 months, sir. Clean record, no disciplinary issues. She's been working maintenance and security details without any problems. Why do you ask? Because General Harrison said slowly. "Unless I'm very much mistaken, Private Martinez here is not exactly what she appears to be." He paused, his gaze still fixed on the partially visible patch. "Tell me, Martinez, when did you last serve with your actual unit?" Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had known this day would come eventually, but she had hoped it would be later rather than sooner. The patch that the general had spotted was from the Nightshade unit, one of the most classified and elite special operations teams in the military. Very few people even knew it existed, and even fewer would recognize its insignia. "Sir, I'm currently assigned to this base as ordered," she replied, trying to deflect without lying outright. General Harrison's expression showed that he wasn't satisfied with her evasive answer. "That's not what I asked, soldier. I asked when you last served with Nightshade." The mention of the unit name sent a chill through Sarah. The fact that this general not only recognized the patch, but also knew the unit's name meant that he had clearance levels that very few people possessed. It also meant that her cover, such as it was, had just been completely blown. Colonel Peterson looked confused. "Nightshade? General, I don't have any record of Martinez being assigned to any unit by that name." "You wouldn't," General Harrison replied grimly. "Nightshade doesn't appear on standard personnel records. It's a compartmentalized unit that operates under different classification levels." He turned back to Sarah. "Now, Martinez, I'm going to ask you one more time. When did you last serve with your actual unit?" Sarah realized she had no choice but to answer truthfully. The general clearly knew enough about Nightshade that any attempt to continue the deception would be pointless and potentially harmful to her career. 18 months ago, sir. My last deployment with Nightshade ended 18 months ago. And since then? Since then, I've been on what my commanding officer called recuperation assignments, sir. Standard rotation after extended deployment in high-stress operations. General Harrison nodded, as if this confirmed what he had suspected. Recuperation assignment. That's military speak for, "We're giving you time to decompress before we send you back into hell." He looked at Colonel Peterson. "Colonel, I'm going to need to speak with you privately about Private Martinez's actual qualifications and experience." Colonel Peterson still looked bewildered by the turn the conversation had taken. "Of course, sir. Should I be concerned about having Martinez assigned to my base?" "Quite the opposite," General Harrison replied. "You should be honored. You've had one of the military's most elite operators doing manual labor for 3 months, and you didn't even know it." The other soldiers working nearby had definitely noticed that something unusual was happening. Private Johnson kept stealing glances while pretending to focus on his sandbags, and Sergeant Williams had moved closer, clearly trying to overhear the conversation without being obvious about it. Sarah felt exposed and uncomfortable with the attention. Part of the reason she had agreed to the recuperation assignment was to have a break from the intense scrutiny and pressure that came with being part of an elite unit. For 3 months, she had been able to be just another soldier, doing routine work without the weight of critical missions and life-or-death decisions. "Martinez," General Harrison said, "I want you to report to the base commander's office at 1,600 hours today. We have some things to discuss." "Yes, sir." "And, Martinez," he added, his voice carrying a note of warning, "I suggest you think carefully about what you want your next assignment to be, because I have a feeling that your recuperation time is about to come to an end." With that, General Harrison turned and walked back toward the group of officers, motioning for Colonel Peterson to follow him. Sarah watched them go, knowing that her quiet months of moving sandbags and maintaining equipment were probably over. Private Johnson sidled up to her as soon as the officers were out of earshot. "What the hell was that all about, Martinez? What did you do to get a general so interested in you?" Sarah picked up another sandbag and positioned it carefully on the growing barrier. "Nothing special," she said, though she knew that her life was about to become very special indeed, and probably very complicated as well. The rest of the work detail passed in a blur of speculation and whispered questions from her fellow soldiers. Word spread quickly through the base grapevine that something significant had happened during the morning work detail, though nobody could quite figure out what it was. Sarah tried to focus on the physical task at hand, Her mind was racing with possibilities about what General Harrison wanted to discuss with her. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about her time with Nightshade and the reasons she had needed a break from that world. The unit specialized in operations that couldn't be accomplished through conventional military means. They worked in the shadows, handling situations that required a combination of specialized skills, quick thinking, and the ability to operate with minimal support or backup. The missions had been successful, but they had taken their toll. After 2 years of constant deployments and high-stress operations, Sarah's commanding officer had recognized that she needed time to step back and recover her mental and emotional equilibrium. The recuperation assignment had been presented as temporary, but Sarah had hoped it might last longer than 18 months. Now, it seemed that her break from the shadows was coming to an end, whether she was ready for it or not. At precisely 1,600 hours, Sarah stood outside the base commander's office, her uniform freshly pressed, and her mind racing with possibilities about what awaited her inside. The conversation with General Harrison had replayed in her head dozens of times throughout the afternoon, and she still wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting. The door opened before she could knock, and Colonel Peterson gestured for her to enter. Inside, General Harrison was seated at the conference table, along with 2 other officers she didn't recognize. Their uniforms bore insignia that suggested they were from different branches of special operations, and their serious expressions indicated that this was not going to be a casual conversation. "Private Martinez, please take a seat," General Harrison said, pointing to a chair across from the assembled officers. "We have some things to discuss regarding your background and potential future assignments." Sarah sat down and folded her hands in her lap, maintaining the professional composure that had been drilled into her during her years of military service. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny as they reviewed what she assumed were classified files spread across the table. "Before we begin," said one of the other officers, a Navy commander whose nameplate read Thompson, "I want to confirm that everything discussed in this room is classified at the highest levels. Nothing we discuss here leaves this room without explicit authorization. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. General Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Martinez, your service record with Nightshade is impressive. 7 successful operations across 3 continents, including some of the most challenging assignments our special operations community has undertaken in the past 5 years." Sarah remained silent, knowing that acknowledgement of classified operations required careful consideration of what she could say even in this secured environment. "Your commanding officer, Colonel Stevens, speaks very highly of your capabilities," continued the 3rd officer, an Army major whose patch indicated he was from psychological operations. "He specifically mentioned your ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances and your skill at maintaining operational security even under extreme pressure." "Thank you, sir," Sarah said, though she wondered where this conversation was heading. General Harrison opened a folder and pulled out several photographs. 3 weeks ago, we lost contact with a joint special operations team that was conducting reconnaissance in a region I cannot specify. The mission was critical to national security, and the team included some of our best personnel. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. Lost contact usually meant one of 2 things in the special operations world. The team was either dead or captured, both of which were scenarios that required immediate and specialized response. "Standard rescue protocols have been exhausted," Commander Thompson added. "The area is too heavily defended for conventional extraction, and the political situation makes official military intervention impossible." "Which brings us to why you're here," General Harrison said. "We need someone with your specific skill set to go in and determine what happened to that team, and if possible, extract any survivors." Sarah had suspected this was coming, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through her. "Sir, with respect, I've been on recuperation assignment for a specific reason. My psychological evaluation recommended an extended break from high-stress operations." Major Williams, the psychological operations officer, consulted his own folder. "I've reviewed those evaluations, Martinez. Dr. Patterson noted stress indicators, and recommended rest, but she also noted that your core psychological stability remained strong. In her assessment, you were dealing with operational fatigue rather than fundamental psychological damage. That may be true, sir, but 18 months isn't a very long recovery period for someone who spent 2 years in constant deployment. General Harrison's expression showed understanding, but also determination. Martinez, I'm not going to lie to you. This is a voluntary assignment. We cannot order you to accept it, given your current status. But I will tell you that the missing team includes people you served with during your time with Nightshade. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Ooh. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez and Staff Sergeant Chund were part of the reconnaissance team. The names hit Sarah like a physical blow. Maria Rodriguez had been her partner on 4 different Nightshade operations, and they had developed the kind of trust that only came from repeatedly relying on each other in life-or-death situations. David Chun had been part of their support team, and his technical expertise had saved their lives more than once. Additionally, Commander Thompson continued, the intelligence they were gathering relates to a terrorist organization that has been developing new tactics specifically designed to counter special operations teams. If that intelligence falls into the wrong hands, it could compromise ongoing operations around the world. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process the implications. She had known that her break from Nightshade operations would eventually come to an end, but she had hoped to have more time to prepare mentally and emotionally for a return to that world. What kind of support would be available? She asked, knowing that her question indicated she was seriously considering the assignment. Minimal, Major Williams admitted. The location and political situation mean that you would be going in essentially alone. You would have communication equipment, but no backup or extraction support until you reached a designated safe zone approximately 40 miles from the insertion point. 40 miles through hostile territory? Correct. Sarah looked at each of the officers in turn, trying to read their expressions and understand what they weren't telling her. What makes you think I can succeed where conventional rescue attempts have failed? General Harrison smiled grimly. Because conventional rescue attempts rely on overwhelming force and technological superiority. This situation requires someone who can think like the enemy, adapt to unexpected circumstances, and operate independently without support. Those are exactly the skills that Nightshade operators specialize in. And Commander Thompson added, because you know Rodriguez and Chun personally. You understand how they think and how they would likely behave if they're still alive. That knowledge could be the difference between success and failure. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The decision she made in this room would not only affect her own future, but could determine whether her former teammates lived or died. It was exactly the kind of pressure she had been hoping to avoid for a while longer. If I accept this assignment, what happens afterward? She asked. That would depend on the outcome, General Harrison replied. If the mission is successful, you would have the option to return to Nightshade operations or continue with recuperation assignment. The choice would be yours. And if I decline the assignment, then we'll respect your decision and continue your current assignment. But we'll also have to find someone else to attempt the rescue. And frankly, there aren't many people with your qualifications available on short notice. Sarah understood the implication. If she refused and the backup plan failed, she would have to live with the knowledge that her friends might have died because she wasn't ready to return to active duty. The room fell silent as the officers waited for her decision. Outside, Sarah could hear the normal sounds of base operations continuing, soldiers going about their routine duties without knowing that a conversation in this room might determine the fate of their missing comrades. After several minutes of consideration, Sarah looked up at General Harrison. If I accept, when would the mission begin? You would need to be ready for insertion within 72 hours. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her decision would change everything about her carefully constructed routine of the past 3 months. But as she thought about Maria and David potentially trapped in enemy territory, the choice became clear. I'll need access to my full Nightshade equipment and a complete intelligence briefing on the target area, she said. General Harrison's expression showed relief and satisfaction. Does that mean you're accepting the assignment? Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I'm back in. The next 48 hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation that felt both familiar and strangely foreign to Sarah. Her body remembered the routines of pre-mission preparation, but her mind struggled to shift back into the focused, analytical mindset that Nightshade operations required. She found herself in the secure briefing facility at 0500 hours each morning, absorbing intelligence reports, studying satellite photographs, and reviewing tactical scenarios. Major Williams had arranged for her to meet with Dr. Patterson, the military psychologist who had originally recommended her recuperation assignment. The conversation was brief but thorough, with Dr. Patterson assessing whether Sarah was mentally prepared to return to high-stress operations. Your stress indicators have improved significantly over the past 18 months, Dr. Patterson noted, reviewing Sarah's psychological profile. But I'm concerned about the abrupt transition back to active duty. Usually, we recommend a gradual reintegration process. There isn't time for gradual, Sarah replied. My teammates have been missing for 3 weeks. Every day we delay reduces the chances of finding them alive. Dr. Patterson nodded understandingly. Your loyalty to your team members is one of your psychological strengths, but it can also be a vulnerability. Don't let personal attachment override tactical judgment. Understood. I'm going to clear you for this mission, but with the recommendation that you receive additional psychological support upon your return. Sarah's equipment preparation took place in a secure facility that housed some of the most advanced military technology available. Her Nightshade gear had been maintained and updated during her absence, and she spent hours reacquainting herself with weapons, communication devices, and survival equipment that could mean the difference between mission success and failure. The intelligence briefing revealed the complexity of her assignment. The missing team had been inserted into a mountainous region controlled by a terrorist organization known as the Red Crescent Brigade. The group had been developing new tactics specifically designed to counter special operations teams, using a combination of advanced technology and guerrilla warfare techniques. The Red Crescent has been studying our operational patterns, explained Commander Thompson during one briefing session. They've learned to anticipate standard rescue procedures and have developed countermeasures accordingly. That's why conventional extraction attempts have failed. The satellite photographs showed a heavily fortified compound in a valley surrounded by steep mountain peaks. The terrain was rugged and difficult, with limited access routes and numerous defensive positions. Getting in would be challenging. Getting out with potential prisoners will be nearly impossible using standard tactics. Your insertion will take place here. Major Williams pointed to a location on the map about 15 miles from the suspected location of the missing team. From there, you'll need to travel overland, gather intelligence about the team's status, and either extract them or confirm their fate. What's the timeline for this operation? Sarah asked. You have a maximum of 7 days from insertion to reach the extraction point, General Harrison replied. After that, we'll have to assume the mission has failed and write off everyone involved. Sarah studied the maps and intelligence reports, looking for patterns and opportunities that might have been missed by previous analysts. Her Nightshade training had taught her to think creatively about problems that seemed impossible to solve through conventional means. The compound has excellent defensive positions against ground assault, she observed, but the surrounding terrain also creates blind spots in their surveillance coverage. If I approach from a northeast ridge, I could potentially observe their operations for several days before attempting any extraction. That's a solid plan, agreed Major Williams. But remember that the Red Crescent has been specifically preparing for special operations infiltration. They may have countermeasures that our intelligence hasn't identified. On her final evening before deployment, Sarah found herself walking the perimeter of the base where she had been moving sandbags just 3 days earlier. The routine work that had seemed so mundane at the time now felt like a luxury she might never experience again. The simplicity of physical labor, the predictable rhythm of daily duties, and the absence of life-or-death decisions had been more restorative than she had initially realized. Private Johnson approached her as she stood looking at the partially completed sandbag barriers. "Hey, Martinez. Word is you're shipping out tomorrow for some kind of special assignment." "Something like that," Sarah replied. "Nobody will tell us what's really going on, but there's been a lot of high-ranking officers around here lately. Must be important." Sarah nodded, but didn't offer any details. Operational security meant that even her fellow soldiers couldn't know the true nature of her mission. "Listen," Johnson continued, "I don't know what kind of unit you're really from, but I wanted to say that working with you these past few months has been good. You never acted like you were better than the rest of us, even though it's obvious you've got training that most of us don't." "Thanks, Johnson. Take care of yourself. You too, Martinez. And whatever you're going to do, be careful." That evening, Sarah completed her final equipment checks and reviewed her mission parameters one last time. Her insertion would take place by helicopter at 0300 hours, with the aircraft approaching the drop zone using terrain masking techniques to avoid detection. From there, she would be completely on her own until she reached the extraction point 7 days later. The weight of the mission pressed down on her as she tried to get some sleep. Maria Rodriguez and David Chun were counting on her, even if they didn't know she was coming. The intelligence they had gathered was critical to national security, and her success or failure could have implications far beyond the immediate rescue mission. But as she lay in her bunk, Sarah found her mind drifting back to her conversation with Dr. Patterson. The psychologist's warning about not letting personal attachment override tactical judgment was sound advice, but it was easier said than followed. Maria had saved her life during a mission in Eastern Europe, and David's technical expertise had gotten them out of a seemingly impossible situation in Southeast Asia. The bonds formed between special operations teammates went beyond normal military camaraderie. They were based on absolute trust and mutual dependence in situations where a single mistake could mean death for everyone involved. Sarah knew that she would risk everything to bring her teammates home safely, and that knowledge both motivated and worried her. At 0200 hours, she was awakened by a gentle shake from the duty sergeant. "Time to go, Martinez. Transport is waiting." Sarah gathered her gear and made her way to the helicopter pad, where a modified Black Hawk waited with its rotors already turning. General Harrison was there to see her off, along with Commander Thompson and Major Williams. "Remember your training," General Harrison said as Sarah approached the aircraft. "Trust your instincts, adapt to circumstances, and don't take unnecessary risks." "Yes, sir." And Martinez, he added, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise, "bring our people home." Sarah nodded and climbed aboard the aircraft. As the helicopter lifted off into the darkness, she looked down at the base where she had spent 3 peaceful months moving sandbags and performing routine maintenance. That simple life was now behind her, and ahead lay the dangerous world of special operations that she had hoped to avoid for a while longer. But as the aircraft flew toward the insertion point, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and focus that came with high-stakes missions. Her body and mind were remembering what it felt like to be a Nightshade operator, and despite her concerns about returning to active duty, she realized that this was who she was meant to be. The rescue of Maria Rodriguez and David Chun would test every skill she had developed during her years with Nightshade, and the outcome would determine not only their fate, but also the future of her own military career. The helicopter insertion went flawlessly, with Sarah rappelling into the mountainous terrain under cover of darkness, while the aircraft disappeared into the night without being detected. She found herself alone in hostile territory with nothing but her training, equipment, and determination to guide her through the next 7 days. The first 2 days were spent moving carefully through the rugged landscape, using her knowledge of tactical movement to avoid detection while gathering intelligence about Red Crescent Brigade operations in the area. Sarah observed their patrol patterns, communication procedures, and defensive positions from concealed observation points that she established along the route to their compound. What she discovered was troubling. The Red Crescent had indeed been studying special operations tactics extensively, and their countermeasures were more sophisticated than the intelligence reports had indicated. They used randomized patrol schedules, employed advanced detection equipment, and had established multiple layers of security around their primary facility. On the third day, Sarah finally reached a position where she could observe the compound where her teammates were believed to be held. Using high-powered optics, she was able to confirm that Maria Rodriguez and David Chun were indeed prisoners, though they appear to be unharmed. They were being held in a separate building within the compound, under heavy guard but apparently receiving adequate medical care. The challenge was figuring out how to extract them. The facility was too well defended for a direct assault, and the surrounding terrain made stealth approach extremely difficult. Sarah spent hours studying the compound layout, looking for weaknesses in their security that she could exploit. Her breakthrough came when she observed the prisoners being moved for what appeared to be interrogation sessions. During these movements, there was a brief window when only 2 guards accompanied Maria and David, and their route took them past a section of the compound that was partially obscured from the main guard towers. Sarah spent the 4th day positioning herself for the rescue attempt and preparing contingency plans for various scenarios. She knew she would have only one chance to succeed, and failure would likely mean death for all 3 of them. On the 5th night, Sarah put her plan into action. Using techniques she had perfected during her Nightshade training, she infiltrated the compound perimeter during a shift change when guard attention was focused elsewhere. Moving through shadows and using the compound's own defensive structures for concealment, she reached the predetermined intercept point just as Maria and David were being escorted to their interrogation session. The takedown of the 2 guards was swift and silent, accomplished before they could raise an alarm. Maria and David's initial shock at seeing Sarah quickly gave way to relief and professional focus as they realized a rescue operation was underway. "Sarah, how did you find us?" Maria whispered as Sarah freed them from their restraints. "Long story. Right now, we need to get out of here before they realize you're gone." David handed Sarah a small data storage device. "This contains the intelligence we gathered. Whatever happens, this information needs to get back to command." Sarah secured the device and began leading her teammates through the compound using a route she had carefully scouted during her reconnaissance. They moved silently through the shadows, avoiding guard patrols and surveillance equipment while making their way toward the perimeter. Their escape was discovered sooner than Sarah had hoped. An alarm began blaring when they were still 200 yards from the compound fence, and searchlights began sweeping the area where they were hiding. The Red Crescent forces responded quickly and professionally, sealing off potential escape routes with a precision that confirmed their advanced training. "They're too organized," Maria observed as they took cover behind storage building. "This isn't going to be like breaking out of a typical terrorist compound." Sarah agreed, but she had prepared for this possibility. During her reconnaissance, she had identified several cache points where she had positioned equipment that might be needed for various contingencies. One of these caches contained explosives that could create the distraction they needed to escape. "I'm going to create a diversion at the vehicle depot," she told Maria and David. "When the explosion happens, you run for the northeast fence line. There's a weak point about 50 meters to the right of the main gate where the terrain drops off. You can get through there and reach the rally point we discussed." "What about you?" David asked. "I'll catch up. Now go." Sarah made her way to the vehicle depot while Maria and David positioned themselves for their escape run. The explosives she had cached were powerful enough to destroy several vehicles and create a significant distraction, but she needed to time the detonation perfectly to maximize their effectiveness. The explosion lit up the night sky and sent Red Crescent forces running toward the vehicle depot to assess the damage and fight the resulting fires. In the confusion, Maria and David were able to reach the fence line and escape the compound without being detected. Sarah's own escape proved more challenging. The Red Crescent forces quickly realized that the explosion was a diversion, and they began systematically searching for the escaped prisoners. Sarah found herself cut off from her planned escape route, trapped inside the compound with enemy forces closing in on her position. Using her Nightshade training in urban combat and evasion, Sarah fought a running battle through the compound, using the terrain and structures to her advantage while avoiding direct confrontation with superior numbers. She was able to eliminate several enemy soldiers who got too close, but she knew that her situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Her salvation came from an unexpected source. Maria and David, instead of proceeding to the rally point as instructed, had positioned themselves outside the compound with equipment Sarah had cached for emergencies. When they realized she was trapped, they created their own diversion by attacking a Red Crescent patrol, drawing enemy forces away from Sarah's location. The distraction gave Sarah the opening she needed to reach the perimeter and escape the compound. She met up with Maria and David at a predetermined rally point, and together they began the difficult journey to the extraction zone 40 miles away. The next day and a half were a grueling test of endurance and tactical skill as Red Crescent forces pursued them through the mountainous terrain. The enemy used helicopters, tracking dogs, and coordinated ground patrols to try to recapture the escaped prisoners and eliminate the rescue team. Sarah's training and experience proved crucial during this phase of the operation. She was able to anticipate enemy movements, set up ambush positions when necessary, and find routes through the terrain that avoided the heaviest concentrations of pursuing forces. On the seventh day, with just hours remaining before the mission deadline, Sarah led her team to the extraction point where a helicopter was waiting to take them to safety. As they lifted off from the mountain valley, Sarah looked back at the terrain they had crossed and felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The mission had been successful. Maria Rodriguez and David Chun were safe, the critical intelligence had been secured, and the Red Crescent Brigade had learned that their sophisticated countermeasures were not enough to stop a determined Nightshade operator. During the flight back to base, Maria turned to Sarah with a grateful expression. "Thank you for coming for us. I know you were on recuperation assignment." "Teammates don't leave teammates behind," Sarah replied simply. When they arrived at the base, General Harrison was waiting with the same group of officers who had briefed Sarah before the mission. The debrief session would take several hours, but the general's expression showed that he was satisfied with the outcome. "Outstanding work, Martinez," he said as she handed over David's intelligence device. "This operation couldn't have succeeded without your specific skills and experience." As Sarah walked across the base toward the debriefing facility, she passed the area where she had been moving sandbags just a week earlier. Private Johnson was there with a new work detail, and he waved when he saw her. "Hey, Martinez, good to see you back safely." Sarah waved back, knowing that Johnson had no idea what she had actually been doing for the past week. To him and most of the people on base, she was just another soldier returning from a routine assignment. But Sarah knew that her life had fundamentally changed during this mission. The successful rescue had proven to herself and to her commanders that she was ready to return to active duty with Nightshade. The question now was whether she wanted to continue with special operations or return to the quieter life of routine assignments. As she entered the debriefing facility, Sarah realized that she already knew the answer. The past week had reminded her why she had joined Nightshade in the first place, and why the work they did was so important. Moving sandbags had been a peaceful interlude, but her real calling was in the shadows, protecting her country and her teammates through missions that most people would never know about. The Nightshade unit patch on her vest was no longer something she needed to hide. It was a symbol of who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing when the stakes were highest and failure was not an option.